April 1945. The city of Cologne was a landscape of broken stone and shattered dreams. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of cordite, dust, and decay. For 6 long years, war had consumed Germany, and now it was dying in a final, violent convulsion on the very streets where children once played. The 101st Airborne Division moved like ghosts through the rubble. Their boots crunched on broken glass and splintered wood. Every corner could conceal a sniper. Every pile of debris could hide a booby trap. This was the heart of the Reich, and it was refusing to die quietly. Sergeant Jack Mallon led his squad through the skeletal remains of what was once a thriving neighborhood. His face was grim, etched with the fatigue of 100 such advances. His orders were clear: clear the sector and advance toward the Rhine. The great river was the last major barrier into the heart of Germany. Every minute counted. "Movement! 2 o'clock!" one of his men hissed, dropping to a knee and leveling his rifle. The squad froze. Mallon squinted through the drifting smoke. A figure emerged from the ruins of a large, imposing building that might have once been a church or a hospital. It wasn't a soldier. It was a woman, thin and pale, dressed in the stained gray dress of a nurse. Her hands were raised, and her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the guns pointed at her. She called out in German, her voice a desperate, cracking thing. "Kinder, bitte, Kinder." Mallon didn't speak German, but he knew that word. Children. He held up a fist, signaling his men to hold their fire. He approached her slowly, his own weapon lowered but ready. She was trembling, pointing back toward the shattered building. "Krankenhaus. Hospital," she stammered, switching to broken English. "Children. Left. Please." Mallon exchanged a glance with his corporal, a young man from Ohio named Miller. This was a trap. It had to be. Why would anyone be left in this hellscape? But the raw, desperate panic in the nurse's eyes was not something that could be faked. Against every instinct, against all his training that screamed trap, Sergeant Mallon made a decision. "Show me," he said, his voice low and steady. He followed her through the blasted doorway into the oppressive silence of the ruined hospital. The stench of death and sickness grew stronger. This was not the front line. This was something else. This was a tomb, and he was about to discover who was left inside. The inside of the hospital was a vision of hell. Daylight streamed through holes in the ceiling, illuminating swirling dust and the grotesque shadows of shattered medical equipment. The air was cold and damp, carrying a foul mixture of mildew, stale urine, and the sweet, cloying smell of infection. The German nurse, who introduced herself as Sister Clara, led Mallon and 2 of his men down a crumbling staircase into the basement. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the beam of Mallon's flashlight. The sound hit them first. Not the cries of soldiers or the blast of artillery, but a weak, pathetic whimpering. The sound of small, exhausted voices. Mallon's flashlight beam swept across the room, and what he saw would be seared into his memory forever. Dozens of children were huddled together on thin, filthy mattresses spread across the concrete floor. They were emaciated, their eyes huge and hollow in gaunt faces. Their limbs were twisted by diseases like polio and cerebral palsy. Some lay listlessly, too weak to move. Others stared at the American soldiers with a terror beyond their years. These were the ones the world had thrown away. The disabled, the inconvenient, the children the retreating German army and even many civilians had deemed not worth saving. Sister Clara stood beside Mallon, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "They take the walking," she whispered, her voice thick with shame and anger. "They leave. These. We have no food, No medicine. For 3 days. Only water. Corporal Miller, the young soldier from Ohio, visibly recoiled. "My God, Sarge," he breathed. "They're just kids." Mallon's military discipline, the hard shell he had built over years of combat, cracked. He saw a little boy, no older than 5, trying to drag his lifeless legs across the floor. He saw a girl clutching a ragged doll, her body contorted by spasms. He thought of his younger brother, Michael, back in Boston, who had been confined to a wheelchair after a childhood bout with polio. The image of Michael, safe and loved, clashed violently with the scene of abandonment before him. His radio crackled to life. "Eagle 1, this is command. Report your position. You are behind schedule. Acknowledge." The voice of his commanding officer was crisp, impatient. The war was moving on. The Rhine was waiting. Mallon looked at the children. He looked at the desperate faces of the 3 German nurses who had stayed to face certain death with their charges. He keyed his radio, his jaw tight. "Command, this is Eagle 1, he said, his voice dangerously calm. "We have a situation. Non-combatants. Request instructions for evacuation." The reply was immediate and brutal. "Negative, Eagle 1. Your objective is the river. Leave them for the follow-on units. Acknowledge and proceed." The order hung in the fetid air. Leave them. Follow-on units might not arrive for days. In this basement, days meant death. Sergeant Jack Mallon made his choice. He looked at Corporal Miller, then at the other soldiers who had followed him down. "We're not leaving them," he said, his voice low, leaving no room for argument. It was not the voice of a soldier following orders. It was the voice of a man. The basement fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the children. Corporal Miller was the first to speak, his voice a hushed whisper. "Sarge, that's a direct order. They'll court-martial you. They'll throw the book at all of us." Sergeant Mallon didn't take his eyes off the children. "Look at them, Miller," he said, his voice low but firm. "You really think there will be any follow-on units for this place? They're forgotten. We walk away now. We're signing their death warrants." He turned to face his men, his expression grim but resolute. "I'm not ordering any of you to do this. This is on me. But I am getting these kids out." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant crump of artillery. Then, Private Jenkins, the squad's medic, slung his rifle over his shoulder. "Hell with it," he grunted, kneeling down next to a small boy burning up with fever. "I didn't sign up to let kids die in cellars." One by one, the other soldiers nodded. The bond of the squad, forged in fire, was stronger than the fear of a court-martial. They were staying. The immediate problem was staggering. How do you move nearly 36 severely disabled children, some unable to walk, others in constant need of care, through an active combat zone? They had no stretchers, no ambulances, nothing. "All right, think," Mallon commanded, his mind racing. "We improvise. Jenkins, you and Schmidt assess their medical states. Miller, take 2 men and scavenge this building. I want every door, every curtain, every strong piece of cloth you can find. We're making litters." The squad exploded into action. Doors were carefully pried from their hinges. Thick, heavy drapes were torn down and cut into strong straps. Within an hour, they had created a dozen crude but serviceable stretchers. Sister Clara and the other 2 nurses moved among the children, their faces a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning hope. They spoke softly in German, calming the terrified little ones, explaining that the American soldiers were here to help. The initial fear in the children's eyes began to slowly fade, replaced by a fragile, wary trust. Mallon approached Sister Clara. "The closest American field hospital is on the west bank of the Rhine. We took the bridge yesterday, but the area is still hot. It's almost a mile through the ruins. Can your children survive the journey?" Sister Clara's eyes were hard with a determination that mirrored his own. They have survived this long, Sergeant. They are stronger than they look, and they will not survive if they stay here. Malin nodded. The plan was insane. It was a desperate gamble. But it was the only one they had. He looked at the small, pale faces, at the twisted limbs, and he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any military order, that they had to try. The procession that emerged from the ruined hospital was something from a fever dream. A line of American paratroopers, their faces grim and weapons slung, carried makeshift stretchers fashioned from doors and torn curtains. On each litter lay a small, fragile child. Those who could walk clung to the hands of the German nurses or the uniforms of the soldiers, their tiny steps faltering on the rubble. They moved as a single, vulnerable organism through the canyon of shattered buildings. Sergeant Malin was at the point, his eyes constantly scanning the upper windows, his rifle held tight. Every shadow was a threat. Every echo of gunfire in the distance made the children whimper and the soldiers tense. Progress was agonizingly slow. The stretcher-bearers had to navigate over piles of brick and around shell craters. The children were heartbreakingly light, but the strain of carrying them carefully over such terrain quickly drained the men. Private Jenkins, the medic, moved up and down the column, checking on his small patients. He paused by a little girl on Malin's stretcher, placing a hand on her forehead. "Her fever's spiking, Sarge. We need to move faster." "There is no faster," Malin grunted, adjusting his grip on the door he was carrying. The little girl, whose name was Liesel, looked up at him with glassy, trusting eyes. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from a building 50 yards ahead. A sniper. The column froze. Men dropped to their knees, unslinging their rifles, forming a protective cordon around the children. "Contact front!" Malin yelled, his voice cutting through the panic. He and Corporal Miller laid their stretcher down gently behind a pile of rubble. "Miller, suppress that window. Jenkins, get the kids covered." The air erupted with the sound of American return fire. The children started to cry, their whimpers turning into terrified wails. Sister Clara and the other nurses threw themselves over the little ones on the ground, shielding them with their own bodies. For 5 long minutes, a fierce firefight raged. The Americans, trained for this, efficiently laid down suppressing fire while a fire team flanked the building. Finally, a grenade blast from inside silenced the sniper's nest. The silence that followed was deafening. Smoke drifted from the building. A young private had a bloody gash on his arm from a ricochet. But miraculously, none of the children were hit. Malin stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the terrified faces of the children, at the sheer, unadulterated courage of his men, at the German nurses who had chosen to die with their charges. This was no longer a tactical decision. It was a crusade. He walked over to Liesel's stretcher and picked up his end. His voice was rough with emotion when he spoke, not as a sergeant to his men, but as one human to another. "Everyone on your feet," he said. "We're not stopping. We're getting these kids home." The final barrier stood before them. The Rhine River, a wide, cold, and relentless expanse of gray water. The great bridge they had been heading for was a twisted skeleton of steel, destroyed in the fighting. The far bank, where safety and the field hospital lay, seemed a world away. The group huddled in the shell-pocked ruins of a riverside warehouse. The wind coming off the water was bitterly cold, cutting through the thin rags the children wore. Their makeshift convoy had reached its end. There was no way forward. "We're stuck, Sarge," Corporal Miller said, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. "No bridge. The current's too strong to swim, even if we could." Sergeant Malin scanned the riverbank, his mind racing. They had come too far to fail now. His eyes fell on a cluster of small rubber assault boats, abandoned by an engineering unit during the initial crossing. They were designed for a handful of soldiers, not for stretchers and children. "It's not ideal," Malin said, a new plan forming in his mind. "But it's all we have. We'll use the boats. We'll make multiple trips." The mere sight of the water sent a fresh wave of terror through the children. The little girl, Liesel, began to cry uncontrollably, clutching at Malin's jacket. The German nurses looked at the flimsy boats with undisguised horror. Private Jenkins shook his head, his medic's mind assessing the new dangers. "Sarge, the water is freezing. If one of these boats capsizes, the children, they won't last a minute, and the far bank might still have enemy observers." It was then that Sister Clara stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. She looked not at Malin, but at the children. "We have come this far because of your courage," she said in her clear, accented English, meant for the soldiers and the children alike. "We will not be afraid of the last step. We will go with you." Her calmness was an anchor in the storm of fear. The other nurses began to soothe the children, whispering reassurances, holding small, trembling hands. The evacuation began. It was a painstaking, nerve-shredding process. 2 soldiers would carefully load a single stretcher into a boat, then paddle furiously across the churning river, their progress agonizingly slow. A German nurse accompanied each trip, huddling over the child to shield them from the spray and the cold. Malin made the first crossing with Liesel. The little girl stared up at the sky, her eyes wide, her tiny hand gripping his finger so tightly it turned white. Every second on the water felt like an eternity, the far bank never seeming to get any closer. He could feel the icy water seeping through the rubber, the vulnerability of their position absolute. Finally, their boat scraped onto the gravel on the far shore. American MPs and medics, alerted by radio, rushed forward to take the child. The look of stunned disbelief on their faces as they saw the small, disabled German girl in the arms of a battle-hardened paratrooper was a story in itself. Malin didn't wait for thanks. He pushed the boat back into the water. There were more children waiting, more lives hanging in the balance on the wrong side of the river. The far bank of the Rhine was a different world. A sprawling American field hospital had sprung up like a city of white tents, its orderly chaos a stark contrast to the primordial destruction they had just left behind. The air here smelled of disinfectant and damp earth, not smoke and death. As the last rubber boat carrying the final children and the German nurses touched the shore, a strange, hushed stillness fell over the busy medical compound. The organized frenzy of surgeons and orderlies ground to a halt. Everyone stopped to stare at the impossible procession emerging from the river. Battle-hardened paratroopers, their uniforms caked in mud and soot, were carrying, with unimaginable tenderness, the most fragile of cargo. They moved with a weary, deliberate care, their faces etched not with the rage of combat, but with a profound, exhausted compassion. A head nurse, a formidable woman from Alabama named Captain Evans, stood frozen, a clipboard hanging limply at her side. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. The gaunt, disabled children on their makeshift stretchers, the 3 German nurses clinging to each other, and the sheer, defiant humanity of it all. "Sweet Mother of God," she whispered, before her training kicked in. Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the silence. "Don't just stand there. Get these children to triage, now, all of them." The hospital erupted into a new kind of action. Medics gently took the stretchers from the soldiers' numb hands. Children were whisked away to warm cots, their ragged clothes cut away, their emaciated bodies examined, their wounds cleaned and dressed. The miracle of modern medicine, so long denied to them, was finally theirs. Sergeant Mallon and his men stood together in a ragged group, watching the flurry of activity they had set in motion. The adrenaline that had sustained them for the last several hours drained away, leaving them hollow and shaking with fatigue. They had done it. It was then that Sister Clara approached them. She walked slowly, her own strength nearly spent. She stopped in front of Sergeant Mallon. Her eyes, which had held so much terror and desperation, now swam with tears she could no longer contain. They streamed down her grimy cheeks, cutting clean paths through the dirt. She tried to speak, to thank him, but no words came out. Instead, her body was racked with silent, shuddering sobs. The weight of weeks of terror, of hopelessness, of bearing witness to unimaginable suffering finally broke within her. She wept for the children she thought she would have to watch die. She wept for the city that was gone. She wept for the incredible, impossible kindness of the enemy. She simply reached out and took Mallon's rough, scarred hand in both of hers, holding it tightly, her head bowed. It was a gesture that transcended language, rank, and nationality. It was the raw, unvarnished gratitude of one human being to another. Mallon, a man who had faced death without flinching, found his own eyes stinging. He simply nodded, unable to trust his own voice. There were no words adequate for this moment. The tears of a German nurse were all the testimony his actions would ever need. The silence in the command tent was heavier than any artillery barrage Sergeant Mallon had ever endured. Colonel Riggs, his commanding officer, stood with his back turned, staring at a map of the Rhine crossing. Mallon and his squad stood at rigid attention behind him. They had been relieved of their weapons. The air smelled of damp canvas and impending judgment. "Sergeant Mallon," Riggs began, his voice dangerously quiet. "You diverted your squad from a critical military objective. You exposed your men to unnecessary danger. You directly disobeyed a lawful command. In doing so, you potentially compromised the entire advance on this sector. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mallon's throat was dry. "No excuse, sir." The colonel finally turned. His face was not what Mallon expected. It wasn't pure anger he saw there, but a complex storm of frustration, confusion, and something else. Something that looked like reluctant understanding. 43 children, Riggs said, the number hanging in the air like a ghost. Most of them crippled. Half of them wouldn't have lasted the week. The medics tell me you carried them over a mile through active combat and then across a contested river. He paused, his eyes scanning the exhausted, defiant faces of the squad. "Why?" It was Corporal Miller who broke protocol and spoke, his voice cracking. "Sir, we just couldn't leave them there to die. It wasn't right." The colonel's stern gaze swept over them. He walked slowly along the line of soldiers, stopping in front of Private Jenkins, the medic, whose arm was now neatly bandaged. "Captain Evans at the field hospital informs me," Riggs continued, his tone shifting, becoming almost conversational, "that one of the German nurses broke down completely during debriefing. She said your men, my men, were angels of mercy. She said they wept when they saw American soldiers carrying their tiny patients to safety." He returned to his desk and picked up a piece of paper. "I also have a dispatch from Division Intelligence. The German resistance in that sector collapsed hours ago. Your diversion had zero tactical impact on the advance." The colonel looked at Mallon, and for the first time, a faint, grim smile touched his lips. "It seems, Sergeant, that you and your men didn't just save children. You may have given us something far more valuable in the long run. You showed the enemy that we are not the monsters their propaganda claims. That is a weapon no artillery shell can match." He crumpled the report in his hand. "Consider this matter closed. There will be no court-martial. There will be no notation in your records. Now get your men some hot chow and a few hours of rest. God knows you've earned it." As they filed out of the tent, numb with relief, Malin paused at the entrance. He looked back at the colonel. "Thank you, sir." Colonel Riggs was already looking back at his map, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Don't thank me, Sergeant. Just remember the weight. It's heavier than any weapon you'll ever carry." Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds over the Rhine. The war was not over, but for 43 children, and the men who refused to abandon them, a different kind of victory had been won. A victory not of territory, but of the human soul. It was a story that would remain hidden for decades, a quiet testament to the fact that in the darkest of times, the brightest light often comes from the most unexpected places.